Good morning, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to a very special edition of Breaking News, a Sunday edition, something we haven't done in a while, and we said we would do it when events warranted it, and they certainly warrant it now. It is the 23rd day of February, 2025, and we're going to look at three very important stories for you that kind of put things into perspective where we're at right now. Now, what happened yesterday, and this is fascinating. Israel has decided to grow a backbone here. They're not going to release the Palestinian prisoners that were going to release yesterday because of the continued violations of Hamas. And so they said, all right, even though four more hostages, the bodies of dead hostages are supposed to be released Thursday, that end the first phase of the deal. Israel has said, as we're going to see, no more prisoners, Palestinian prisoners will be released until you release more living hostages that you hold. And we know there's at least two of them because what Hamas did something terribly. I don't know if you saw this story yesterday. As the six hostages were being released, Israeli hostages, they were filming two men who are still being held hostage there in Gaza. And these men were in a car driving around Gaza, and they were watching the live stream of the hostages that were being released. And they said, "Well, how do you feel about that?" Showing they're still living hostages there in in Gaza, Israeli hostages. And so Israel said, "Look, enough's enough now. These people who we're going to release, we're not going to release now until, first of all, you give us the four dead hostages that were in phase one, and then give us some more living hostages. Then you'll get this group." And this is interesting. So we've got that going on. Then we've got two stories as to where to put the Gazans when all is said and done. The first emphasizes how complicated the matter is from the Wall Street Journal. And then there's a very simple solution from an Israeli website in New Zealand, of all places, which goes back to the original agreement to 1917 as to the extent of the borders of Israel. And the solution they say, well, it's simple, just give Gaza back to either Egypt or Jordan. And this is fascinating. So, anyway, we'll look at that. I think all this will be very helpful today. All right, let's look at these headlines. Number one, Netanyahu says Israel delays the prisoners' release until Hamas agrees to free more hostages. It has been decided to delay the release of the terrorist plan for yesterday until the release of the next hostages is ensured. This is from the Prime Minister's office. Israel will postpone the release of these prisoners until additional Israeli hostages are released or are secured, the Prime Minister's office announced last night, Israeli time. They cited Hamas's repeated violations of the ceasefire hostage deal as the reason for the postponement. Hamas on Sunday condemned Israel's decision, saying its claim that the hostages handover ceremonies are humiliating was false and a pretext to evade Israel's obligation under the Gaza ceasefire agreement. The release of Palestinian prisoners is expected to take place when the next round of hostages are released. This is interesting now. The Prime Minister's office announcement came after Netanyahu convened a meeting with his defense minister, then the finance minister, and a couple other people of his senior officials there. Now, the takeaway is the decision comes due to Hamas's repeated violations. Due to Hamas's repeated violations, including ceremonies that disgrace our hostages' dignity and the cynical use of hostages for propaganda purposes, it has been decided to delay the release of the terrorist plan for yesterday until the release of the next hostages is ensured. Now, Israel wants Hamas to release the bodies of the next four hostages earlier than was set to release on Thursday, and to extend the first phase of the hostage deal to include further release of living hostages. Israel says that since Hamas has violated the agreement when they didn't return Shiri Babas's body, the four bodies of the slain hostages should also have been returned earlier. And so this is where they're at right now. So it's going to be real interesting to see how this plays out. Again, as always, there are many possibilities as what the reactions will be. So as always, stay tuned. All right. Well, the next two stories are going to emphasize the problem of the ownership of the Gaza Strip. In other words, what's going to happen the day after and what should be done to those presently living in it. Now, I have a story from the Wall Street Journal says Trump wants the U.S. to control Gaza. So who owns it anyway? Figuring out the enclave's ownership is possibly one of the world's hardest territorial questions, the article begins. United Nations says about 70% of the structures in the Gaza Strip are destroyed or damaged, including more than 245,000 housing units. The tonnage of the destruction to to haul it away is literally going to take years, according to all estimations. And so, what do you do in the meantime? Well, as the article says, President Trump wants the U.S. to control the Gaza Strip, but it is even clear who owns it. Determining that might be among the most complicated territorial questions on earth. The Palestinian enclave has an almost unique status as well as a long history of changing hands. That's the understatement of the year, making figuring out who ultimately owns the tiny territory a matter of unpacking overlapping land laws laid down over centuries. And so, under the heading Who Controls Gaza Now, Gaza is effectively run by Hamas terrorists, but the United Nations says it is unlawfully occupied by Israel. Most countries consider the war-torn strip part of quote-unquote Palestine, which itself isn't recognized as a state by the U.S., among others. And there's no such thing as the Palestinians, and we've talked about this before. Prime Minister Netanyahu said Israel doesn't want to occupy Gaza at the end of the war, and he has praised Trump for what he says was creative thinking and proposing to relocate Palestinians from the Strip, something the UN has warned could contravene international law. So the question is, how would Trump take over? Now, Trump has offered, according to this article, few concrete details about his plans for Gaza, beyond saying that the U.S. would invoke United States authority to control it. He has said that the U.S. wouldn't buy Gaza or use American troops to take it, but the U.S. should have long-term control to turn the territory, Philadelphia-sized territory into the Riviera of the Middle East. The nearly 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza would relocate to either Jordan and Egypt, both Jordan and Egypt, in Trump's vision. He's threatened to withhold aid from these countries if they refuse to take the displaced people, though he has since said such freezes wouldn't be necessary. Again, nobody knows how Trump's plan will play out. Friday, as we mentioned, was going to take place, to get to mention yesterday. Certain Arab states met and informally discussed how Gaza should be rebuilt and what should happen to the inhabitants. They all agreed that the Gazans should not leave where they now reside, though some 70% of the buildings have been devastated. Now, this next article is fascinating. It comes from an Israeli website in New Zealand, which gives a simple history of Gaza from the time of the idea of a modern state of Israel was encouraged by the British in 1917 until the present. It also suggests a very interesting solution. So we've given you the link of this, and you might want to read it. It's called Relocating Gazans to Egypt. This is from Israeli Institute .nz, and the article is written by Ashley Church. Over the past few days, U.S. President Trump has repeatedly insisted that some or all of the citizens of Gaza must be relocated to other Arab states. At first glance, this demand might seem unreasonable or absurd, but it actually has a surprising degree of historical precedent, and had history played out differently, may have allowed the world to avoid the situation which exists today. Now, here they go through what's gone on. First of all, in 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration indicating their support for a Jewish homeland. In this article, they have a little map where the homeland would have been. In 1922, Britain was granted a mandate to control a significant portion of the Middle East territories some 5 years later after World War I, which was formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, which was defeated in World War I. However, now get this, and this is something we've mentioned before and it's hardly ever mentioned. As a result of strong Arab lobbying, the land originally proposed for a Jewish state was reduced by 77%. They have a second map that shows this in order to create a Palestinian protectorate known as Transjordan, which later became Jordan. Despite this, the Arab nations still continued to oppose the establishment of a Jewish state. Then in 1947, following the atrocities of the Holocaust, the newly formed United Nations voted to establish a Jewish state. However, the surrounding Arab nations, as we know, attacked Israel when it formally declared independence May 14, 1948, telling the Arabs to flee to the borders until the Israelis were defeated. This is what the Arabs told their own people: flee to the borders until you're defeated. So what happened was Israel won that war. And the Arabs who fled, there was about 80% of the Arabs who were living in the territory at that time, they became refugees in both Gaza and the West Bank. These territories then came under the control of Jordan and Egypt. There's a map now that shows where they controlled them and where these people were, neither of which chose to assimilate them or create a Palestinian state for them. So in the West Bank And in Gaza, you have these refugees that left where they were living because they were told by their Arab brethren, just go for a while. We're going to wipe out the Israelis. You can come back home. And 80% of them were gone and never came back. Now, in 1967, here's what's fascinating. Israel won the Six-Day War, in which they secured their ancient capital of Jerusalem. They took possession of the Sinai Peninsula and became responsible for the Gaza and the West Bank. So now it's under Israeli hands, 1967. Sinai was subsequently returned to the Egyptians as part of the peace deal in 1982. But here's the kicker. Neither Egypt nor Jordan had expressed any appetite to reclaim Gaza or the West Bank, a situation that continued to this day. And this is where all the refugees were. So in other words, Israel, you take it. We don't want to mess with this. As such, and here's the simple solution. A simple solution would be to simply reabsorb Gaza back into Egypt. No relocation would be necessary, and the Gazans would suddenly have free access to live anywhere in a nation many times larger than Israel, which also shares the same religion. Or they could be absorbed into Jordan, a nation that was established to provide a Palestinian homeland over 100 years ago, the original two-state solution. The second state is Jordan, a fact which is conveniently ignored by most who use the term today about the two-state solution. And he goes on to say, or she goes on to say, Ashley, I guess she obviously, either way, Trump is right. The Palestinians are responsibility of the Arab nations of the Middle East. Perhaps for once, we can learn from history. That's great. What a great article. So to sum up, we have so many difficulties that need to be ironed out. And as always, we emphasize that God has told us what's going to eventually happen to Israel, the Jewish people, and our world at the time of the end of the age, culminating the return of Christ. For those of you who are new to this ministry, please check out our website, Educating Our World, where we have 65 free books on 11 different biblical topics available for free download, include 12 on the subject of Bible prophecy, especially 25 signs. We're near the end. So as we continue to look at the ongoing situation there, again, so much is up for grabs. We don't know how it's going to all end in the short term, but in the long term, we certainly know. So we'll keep informed every day. But we thought this would be helpful to mention, especially because it looked like Israel yesterday finally grew a backbone and says, no, we're not going to give you these prisoners because you keep messing us around here. Every time there's a hostage exchange, we've just had enough. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be really interesting. All right, later today, again, we'll have our Sunday message. And this is something I believe all of us should be interested in. I certainly am. And it's from my book, 25, my favorite 25 messages that I preach. And it's on the subject of prayer. We're going to have two Sundays, today and next Sunday, talk about prayer. Lord, teach us to pray. How do we pray? Why should we pray? And it's very important, some very basic truths about the subject of prayer, something none of us, I guarantee, none of us use as much as we should, the power we have of prayer. And hopefully this will encourage you to do so. Anyway, I'm Don Stewart. Thanks for watching. Until later today, may the Lord richly, richly bless.